In this video, I'm going to show you how to build a workbench for your garage or workshop, and I'm going to include installing outlets on it, installing wheels so it's going to be mobile, and the whole 9 yards. And if you're new to this channel, my name's Josh. This channel is all about DIY to save a ton of money. So be sure to subscribe, ring that bell so you get notification every time I release a new video, and hammer that like button for me. That's all I ask in return for making this video. So we got a lot to go over today, so let's get started. This is what I've been using as a workbench in my garage for a while now. It's just a 4x8 sheet of plywood supported by sawhorses, which it works great for most things, but if I need something that's going to work as an outfeed table for my table saw and something very stable so I can use it for building other things, I need to upgrade this workbench. So this is what we're going to replicate, something that's going to be at least 48 inches wide and about 8 foot long. So I'll show you the specs as we go. And I need to first think about the height in which I want to build it. So I'm going to key off the last project from the last video so we can get our countertop height. The workbench is going to be placed over here in the middle of the garage. So I'm going to place my laser level here and get it level with the bottom of this countertop so I know the height in which I got to cut my post for my workbench. The laser is directly underneath the countertop. I'm going to measure over here where I want to build the workbench. And something different compared to what I did when I built this workstation is that I'm going to cut all of my posts the same height because since it's going to be mobile, I want to make sure everything is flat as it can be. Unlike this that's stationary, so I cut it each post specific for the floor unevenness. So that's just something a little different from watching this video to doing this video. The corner of the workbench is going to sit roughly right here. I'm going to measure up to the laser level to get my height. We measure up, we got just about 36 inches. So I'm going to cut each post for this workbench 36 inches. Depending on the thickness of your countertop, depends on the ultimate height of your finished top. If you want something that's going to be 36-inch finish like most countertops, you'd cut your post 34 and a half. 34 and a half plus an inch and a half would be 36. So keep that in mind, but I'm making this custom to fit my other workstation so they seem more even. 4x4 posts is what I'm going to be using for the workbench. And these are just standard pine, and I'll put a link in the description below to all the wood material and all the other material used to make this workbench, so be sure to check the description below. I'm going to cut these into 36-inch pieces so I have them for my corner post and the center support post. All right, here are all 6 of my posts. I'm going to line these up with each other and then clamp them together to hold them tight for the next step. And a little tip here, put the nice side facing up because that's going to be the exposed side. So if you have a chip on a corner or a more rough edge, you'd want that down. This is where the top 2x6 is going to connect all the posts together. I'm going to measure down 5.5, maybe a little heavy to give me some room for play. And I'm going to notch this out for the 2x6. And then I'm going to mark the bottom for a 2x4 coming 4.5 inches up off the floor. Going to use my framing square to make a straight line. And mark down here for the 2x4. I'm going to come up 4.5 inches. Make a straight line. And then come up 3.5 inches heavy. Make another straight line to notch out for our 2x4. Using my circular saw with the blade adjusted to a depth of 1.5 inches and again a little heavy to allow for the thickness of a 2x4 and a 2x6, I'm going to cut out multiple cuts at each section that needs notched out before notching it out with a chisel. Using a hammer and chisel, I'm going to knock out the area for the 2x4 and the 2x6. now going to remove the clamps from the post, and we're going to have to continue the notches around 4 of these posts. These are the 4 corner posts, and in order to extend the notch around the sides, and so I don't get confused, I'm going to lay these up so that we know and can visualize them being the corners, because there's nothing worse than notching out a post and realizing it's wrong. So we're going to line these up like so. So we can just think of these as the 4 corners like this on a small scale. So we're going to lay these down, and now we're going to extend our notches for the corners. With these posts flush, I'm going to extend from edge to edge of the notch to mark for our notch. We know this needs cut out yet because you can visualize the 2x6 wrapping around and going over to the next post. And now on this, we're going to notch them out on the other side. And we're going to do the same to the lower side. I'm going to place a clamp to hold these together. And same idea, we're going to cut with our saw and then notch these out. The top that I'm going to make later in this video is 50 inches wide, and it's going to be 95 inches long, and I want a 1-inch overhang around my workbench with the countertop, that is. So if I want to do that, I need to shrink the frame down 2 inches to allow 1 inch around the whole thing. So I need to make sure I cut my lumber 93 inches long, and I want a total of 48 inches wide. So I'm going to build a frame for the top, and whenever we select our material, you want to make sure you eyeball down your material and get the lumber that you can find that is as straight as possible and something that is not crooked at all, because we want to make sure everything stays as true as possible. And I know whenever you're in these big box stores, it's hard to find material that's perfect, and that's okay because nothing's perfect whenever you're working with wood, but we can try to get as best we can. I'm going to now cut my material to length and then assemble the frame now. I have 2 2x6s that are 93 inches long, 2 2x6s that are 45 inches long, 2 2x4s that are 93 inches long, and 2 more 2x4s that are 45 inches long. We're going to sit the 2x4s out of the way and assemble the 2x6 frame that's going to be the top of the workbench. Whenever we place together the 2x6s, we're going to crown them, if there is any crown at all, to where the crown is up. And again, whenever you eyeball it, if there's a hump like this, we want that up. So whenever this is placed together, we actually want to lay it down onto the surface, because we're going to assemble the legs on it while it's laying flat on this sheet of plywood. Using a drill with a countersink, I'm going to line up the corner to where this edge is on the outside and this end is butting up to it. And I'm going to pre-drill a screw hole at the top and bottom at each joint. Using 2 3.5 inch construction screws, I'm going to place one at each the top and the bottom of the joint. And do this at each corner. I'm switching over to these lag screws, and I'll put a link to these in the description below to connect the post to the frame. I have one of the 4 corner posts that's going to be installed in each corner of the frame. We're going to place it upside down and lay it right into where we have it notched out for the 2x6, and it sits in there really well. And something really important to do is take a speed square and make sure we're setting square with our frame, because this is going to make sure we're sitting level once it's actually sitting on the floor. I'm going to install a lag right here where there is wood that we left on this post whenever we notched it out. And I'm going to pre-drill using a 5/32 drill bit first. I'm going to double check to see how plumb we are and square. That looks really good. I'm going to place another lag screw right here. That is an extremely solid connection. I'm going to do that at all 4 corners. To install the center supports, this is pretty self-explanatory, but we're going to find the center of the bench on the long side. Then we're just going to install it square with the frame just like we did the corners and using the lag screws to lag it into place. Something a little different here than the corner post. When we place these lags, we're going to not put them in all the way and leave about 1.5 inches from the end, because we're going to use this same screw to connect our support to this frame, and I'm going to show you that here in just a minute. I have a 2x6 cut to place in between the center post, and this is going to act as a place to support the countertop, and also I have a ripped down 2x4 that I'm going to screw to the side of it. And what that's going to do is give me a place to screw my countertop to from below, so I don't have to place screws from above, so it's going to look better that way. So I'm going to place these into place. In order to secure this, I simply drive these screws all the way in on each side. To install this, very straightforward. We're going to lay it into place. And I'm going to use my construction screws to install this instead of using the lag screws, so we're going back to the smaller construction screws. And I like to place this a little bit off the bottom here, because whenever we screw it in with our screws later, if this is sticking up too high, it's going to hit the countertop and lift it up. So we want to make sure it's definitely underneath the frame. Before we install this rip down 2x4 to screw down the countertop, I'm going to have to back out the lag screw here at the bottom in order to secure it into place first. To assemble the frame for the bottom shelf, we're going to install this while this is upside down as well. And if you're wondering why I'm doing this upside down on a workbench, because it's much easier to work on because we're right here at eye level compared to crawling around on the floor. We're going to install this the exact same way as we did the 2x6s, except we're going to fit right into the grooves that we cut out and notched out earlier. Similar to the top of the workbench, I installed a center support for the lower shelf here as well. I got the workbench frame totally assembled up on the workbench. Now I'm going to set it down onto the concrete floor where I can continue the assembly. An important part to framing the bottom shelf that you may not have seen during that time lapse is the support here in the middle. I figured you assumed I was installing that, but just so you know, because that is very critical to have. Before I build and install the top, I'm going to install 6 receptacles around this workbench using metal cladded or armor cladded cable, whichever term you use, it's the same thing. The reason why I got to use this because we're going to have exposed wiring, and with it being exposed, it needs to be protected. So very important to use this. And I'm also going to be using metal boxes that are designed for the metal cladded cable. And this is going to secure it. And I'm also going to show you some other nuances. But the first step I have to do is cut out the openings in these 2x6s to support the receptacles. And this is also 12-2 wire, by the way, because this is on a 20 amp circuit, so that's very important. Because I want the metal box to be installed in the center and I want it long ways like so, I'm going to measure in between the posts, mark the center. Then I'm going to measure down and get the center of the 2x6 this way so we can mark it right here in the center. 20 5/8 to the center. And I'm going to measure down 2 3/4. Now that I have the center of the box, I'm going to place it up at this angle. And I want to align my screw holes for my receptacle where they're going to be installed with that line. I'm going to hold it tight and trace around the box. And I'm going to trace around the area that needs drilled out. I'm going to drill out the holes here for our screws. And sometimes when you cut this out, you can cut that out with it, but I try to keep it as close as possible. I'm now going to take my oscillating tool and cut that square out. In order to finish securing it, I'm just going to use 1-inch screws in these tabs. That's all there is to anchoring the metal box. I'm going to do that around the whole workbench. I'm going to give you a rundown on how to run this MC cable. This stuff's really easy to do, but a lot of people get intimidated by it. The first thing you need to get are what's called anti-short bushings. And what these are for is they go right in the end of the metal cladding so it doesn't cut or scar the wire after you cut it. And I'll explain more in here in just a moment. So that's something you definitely need to get. I'm going to unband this. I need to run a piece from outlet to outlet in a series. And whenever we strip this, it's really easy to do. I got this tool here, and what this does, whenever you clamp it down here, you're gonna squeeze and then the little saw blade is gonna pop up and cut the casing. And also, some people just break it, but I always use this tool, it's a little easier. So I'm gonna get about 6 inches stripped off here for our first one. It's gonna lay right into this tool. Then we're gonna clamp down on it and we're gonna twist like so. And what that's going to do is cut that cladding. And if you look, it cut the cladding right there and we just twist it off. And I need to cut off a little more just because we need more wire than that. But you get the idea. That's how you strip off the metal cladding. Pretty simple. I'm going to go ahead and strip off a little more like I just mentioned. I'm now going to place a bushing at the end of that cable. To install one of these bushings, you simply just slide it right onto the end of the wire like so, and make sure it covers up that cut end of the cable. Just like that, pretty self-explanatory. Now I'm going to strip these wires off. To strip the wires, pretty easy. I'm going to use a wire stripper. This is 12 gauge, so I'm going to use the 12 here on the teeth. Place it in there, just allow roughly about a 1/2 inch or so. And that's all there is to it. So that's how you prepare the end of the cable. I'm now going to cut this to length to go from one outlet to another. And also I need to drill a hole right in the center of this towards the end in order to get the wire to go through. I now need to show you how to go into the side of the electrical box. I'm going to use a straight screwdriver and just pry back on it like so. And that's going to open it up. I'm now going to take my needle nose and just work that right off. I'm now going to slide my MC cable right into that. We will slide it in until that bushing's right into that box. I'm going to grab the end of those wires and pull them through. And because there's no other wire going to exit here, I'm going to go ahead and tighten this up. And that clamped down on that MC cable to hold it into place. I now need to run another wire into here to make this connection. Now to cut the other end of length, we're going to hold it up to the box and pull past 6 inches and cut it right here. And you can cut this with regular linemen's. And just repeat the process of stripping off 6 inches of armor before going into the box. Because I need to ground the metal box to the receptacle, I got a pigtail here with a ground screw. I'm going to screw this right into the back where this hole is for the ground screw, so we have everything grounded here in just a moment. I'm now going to bring in my next cable coming in through this side. And then I'm going to strip those wires. I now need to make a pigtail to come off these grounds so we can hook to the receptacle. I have a bare copper wire here for the ground to pigtail to the receptacle, so I'm going to twist all these together. I'm now going to tie all these together using a wire nut. And then we're going to place this ground back into the box. I'm now going to install a standard receptacle that's tamper resistant onto this circuit. And we're going to hook the green screw to the ground. The whites will go to the silver screws. Then the gold screws will have the black wires. So I'm going to make loops on each of these to connect. And then simply make our connections and hook the wires up so that they go towards the screw and not away. So if it's hooked like this, obviously when we tighten this up, it's going to draw the wire towards the device. I will have to remove these screws that we're holding the metal box in to install this receptacle first, then we'll have to replace those screws. Then place our screws into the metal box. And now replace the screws through the box and the receptacle. I'm now going to install the cover. That's all there is to installing the outlet. Now I need to do that at each receptacle until we get to the end. I'm at the last receptacle. I'm going to install an 8-foot cord, and I got standard 12-3 cord here that I need to install the ends on myself. So I'm going to install the end on one end that's going to plug into a receptacle, and in this case it's a floor receptacle, and I'm also going to install it into this outlet so that it energizes all the other receptacles on this workbench. I have a 20 amp plug here, and I'm going to take this end out of it. If we open it up, you see we make our connections here. So I'm going to strip the end of this wire in order to make my connections. Looks like I need to strip the sheathing off to here. Using my wire strippers, I'm going to use the stranded number 12 here at the top of the teeth to strip off about 1/4 inch of this. And now we need to make our connections here. Green is ground. The red is going to be a hot, and then we'll use the silver as neutral. And because this is stranded, always like to wiggle then retighten a couple times. I'm now going to unscrew the clamp. And we're going to fish this from the other side of the wire. First, tighten the screws here at the end. After those are tightened, we can now tighten the clamp up all the way. We now have an end on our cord. Now we need to address the other side. This end we stripped just similar to the other wire, just about 6 inches or so, enough to wire into the receptacle. This is going to get installed just like the armor cladded cable, except this is the extension cord. I'm going to use wire staples and secure this cladded cable. So I'm going to go about 6 inches from the edge here and place one, then one about here, and do that around the whole workbench. I'm now going to plug this into the floor receptacle to test out the outlets. I'm going to test the outlets with this Klein outlet tester. I'm just going to plug it in, and if we have 2 lights, as you can see here at the bottom, that's correct wiring. And I'll put a link to this in the description below as well. Test out this first one here. And we have 2 lights lit up here, so we are wired correctly. And I'm going to test them all out. I'm going to begin building the top for this workbench. I got 5 2x6s here, and this is just standard pine that's usually used for framing, so I'm going to build this the cheapest way possible. And sure, I could simply take a 4x8 sheet of this birch plywood that you see here behind me and screw it right down to this workbench, and that would work great. But I want something that's going to hold up over time and something that looks good, so I'm going to go with making a pine top. And you could also build this out of oak, which is going to be much more expensive. I'm just going to go with the cheapest way possible, and that's the pine. And the first thing we need to do is plane down the 2x6s so that we have a perfectly flat top. And then to the next step after that, we're going to join it, and we're going to use our joiner for that. So we're first going to use this planer that you see here behind me to get started on the leveling process for this top. This is what's called a planer. A planer just takes the cup and makes the top of a board surface flat. And this is set just slightly below 1.5 inches, just about 1/8 below, because the 2x6s are 1.5 inches. So we just want to take enough right off that top in order to flatten it out. And I'm going to run it through this planer on just one side. I don't have to do both sides because the unfinished side is going to be underneath of the workbench or table. So just keep that in mind. So I'm going to run all of the boards right through this first. This is a joiner. What a joiner does is make a perfect 90-degree from the top of the board to the side. So that way, whenever we join a bunch of boards together, it's going to make a perfectly flat top, or at least in theory. And the idea here is the plain side of the 2x6, we're going to press tight against this fence, and then it's going to slide on this base, and then this blade that's a planer blade is elevated 1/4 inch. It's going to remove 1/4 inch of the bottom of that 2x6 and make it a perfect 90-degree angle, so that way when we join our boards together, we're going to have a nice top. The reason why I want to take 1/4 inch off, that's because my top needs to be 50 inches wide, and if I have 10 2x6s, if you take 1/4 inch off each side, that's going to give us 50 inches, so that gives me 1 inch overhang on the workbench. And also, these are 8-foot long 2x6s. I wanted to mention that just so you know. And we got to cut a little bit off after we build the top in order to fit on the workbench properly. And something I'd like to mention here as well, you want to make sure that we use these tools whenever we're pressing it tight against the board, so that way your hand isn't next to the planer blade. Very important. And I'm also going to make sure I wear my proper PPE, like I was just doing using the planer. That's ear protection, eye protection, and a respirator. And now I'm going to run all the boards right through this joiner. With the plain side of the board facing up, or the flat side, we're going to lay them facing up across this whole table and flush them up on each end. With all of our boards lined up and flush, I'm going to mark 3 inches from each end on each end of the table, and then 1 foot apart after that, in order to make straight lines for our biscuit joints. As you can see, at each joint, we made a mark to line up for our biscuits. This is what's called a biscuit joiner. It has a lip here that's going to rest right on the edge. And whenever you pull the trigger, it's going to plunge a blade and make a groove into each mark at the joint. And this is how you can set different degrees. And here's the depth adjustment. And I want the depth around 3/4 inch, maybe a little less, which will work fine. And then I have number 20 biscuits. If you look on the back here, there's a 20. That represents this size of biscuit. And then I have a pack of 100 here for this job. So I'm going to show you how to actually make the groove in the side of the board. In order to make the joint, I need to cut a biscuit on this lip and on this edge. So I'm going to move this up out of the way for now, just so you can see how this works. In order to make this biscuit cut, I'm going to lay my biscuit joiner right up on the mark, line it up perfectly with the mark that we made. Make sure we're tight and flat on this surface. Pull the trigger and plunge cut into the board. Now when we go to glue the board together, we'll glue these biscuits in right there, and whenever there's an opposing biscuit cut, it's going to slide into each other and keep the surface flush. That's the whole point of this, is to help keep the surface flush and add strength via the biscuit. I now need to make the cut at each one of these marks. For this next step, I'm going to be using pipe clamps. These have the little stands that elevate them off the floor to keep them flat, which is really nice. So I'm going to lay 4 of these across the floor. Because this is an 8-foot top, 4 should be enough. So I'm just going to come about 1 foot away from the edges, then space them evenly. I'm now going to take my boards and lay them all the same direction. So if we have our plain side here, we want it facing towards me. On all of them except for the very end, we'll keep that off for now. Using wood glue and biscuits, I'm going to place a little bit of glue right into the slot and slide a biscuit in before gluing the edge of the board. I'm going to be sure to put all the biscuits in first. Now that all the biscuits are in the joints, I'm going to place a liberal amount of glue onto the edge itself. And then after I do that, I'm going to lay them down, then slide them together where they were originally placed together. In that end, I don't have anything on it because this is going to be that edge, and that's going to be the one that slides into that, and the glue is going to be applied. So keep that in mind. The top is now glued together, and I'm going to allow 24 hours for that glue to dry before taking off the clamps. And also, you may have noticed me putting these 2x6s on real fast while I was tightening up the clamps. The reason why that is because the top wanted to buckle because it's so wide as I was tightening up the clamps. So I put 2 screws, one on this side of the 2x6 and 2 more on the very end. So that way, as I tightened up the clamps, it didn't buckle that way. Another option I could have done was took these center clamps, and instead of having them all underneath the table, I could have put these 2 on top and tightened them all up equally, so that way it couldn't buckle because we'd have a bar underneath and one above every other one, and that would have been a good idea too. But this works out fine. While this is setting up, we're going to address the lower shelf on the workbench. The top on the bottom shelf is simply going to be 2x6s running long ways on the bottom of the workbench, and I'm going to notch out for the post. So we're going to go right around the post and run our boards flush with the 2x4. So really not too complicated here. So I just want to explain to you what I'm going to be doing in this time lapse. To screw down these boards, I'm going to use a 1/8 inch drill bit with a countersink and pre-drill before screwing the screw into the board. I'm going to use 3.5 inch construction screws to drive the board onto the 2x4. Where the 2x4s intersect, I'm going to place 2 screws at that intersection. To finish up the lower shelf, I did have to rip down the 2x6 in order to fit in between both runs. This part's optional. Most people are going to plug this into a wall outlet nearby, but because I have a floor receptacle underneath this workbench, I'm going to drill a 2-inch hole right here in the corner by the post so I can fish it down and then go over to my outlet. The bottom shelf is now complete other than a little bit of sanding. As for now, this is great, and we're going to move on to the next step. I'm back here the next day. The glue has set up in the joints. I'm going to set the top up to add a little reinforcement here. To make the top stronger before removing these clamps, I'm going to add 2 2x6s, one on this side and one on this side. So that way, whenever we take the clamps off, all these boards are reinforced. First, I'm going to find the center of the top. Then I'm going to come over 22 inches to go in the center of the bay of the workbench. I'm going to get my width of the top. I'm 50 5/8, and I want to make sure my board's in the center because it's going to go between the frame. I want to pre-drill here at the top because this board's going to be anchored about here. So that way we don't split the board. I'm going to come 2 3/4 inch down here. That's going to be the top of our board. I'll be using 2-inch screws, and I'm going to screw it right there where it belongs. I'm going to place 3 screws into each board to hold it all together. Now that the top's up here, I'm going to remove these boards and remove the clamps. The top is sitting up here on the frame and it's looking really good so far. And if you remember these edges, they're going to be jagged, all because whenever you glue this thing together, some ain't going to line up exactly, and you also have some rough cuts here that need straightened out anyways. So I'm going to take my track saw and clamp it down here, then cut this edge off nice and straight. All right, that looks really good. Let me take this off and we'll do the same to the other side. Now that the top's length is final, I'm going to take my tape measure and make sure we're setting the center of the frame going both ways. To anchor the top, I'm going to take a pipe clamp and clamp down right here at each section while I screw it down. As you know, I have that strip of wood up in here to secure the top to the frame. So I'm going to clamp this down first before I put the screw in. I'm now going to pre-drill through that strip and place a screw into the top. This corner is now anchored, and I'm going to place pipe clamps at each corner and section as I screw it down. Above this receptacle is the board that we screwed to the top to support it. For extra support, I'm going to place 2 screws here just to add a little extra security there since we have that option. I'm going to show you how to make a great wood filler using just wood glue and sawdust. And the great thing about this wood filler is that stain will accept to it because it has the sawdust in it. All we have to do is take just sawdust from any of the cuts that we've been making, and I'm going to place it on this scrap piece of board. I'm now just going to place wood glue and the sawdust together and mix it up. And you see we got a paste of sawdust and wood glue mixed, and we're going to place it in any cracks like this one to fill it in. Using the wood shim I was using to mix it up with, I'm just going to smear it into the crack. It's just going to work like a putty knife more or less. And we're going to allow that to dry before sanding. And I'm going to do that to any cracks or screw holes that I find in the boards. Here's a good sample of the top. All I have to do is simply run my belt sander over it against the grain or with the grain, whatever it takes to level this whole area out. And even though you're taking off a very small layer, it's still a good bit when it comes to a sander. So you definitely want to take your time, have patience, and keep going over it. And your hand, believe it or not, is the best thing to feel to see if you're smooth or not. Visually, sometimes it looks like it's even, but it's not. So just run your hand across each of the joints and make sure that they're flush with each other before continuing. And that's pretty much all there is to the belt sanding part. As you can see, it's nice and smooth and it looks almost finished at this point with the sanding, but we're going to do the whole top with the belt sander first, then hit it with a palm sander. I'm now switching over to the 80 grit palm sander, and with the palm sander I'm just going to sand out the marks left by the belt sander and also any other divots or blemishes that I might find. I also like to break underneath the edge like so. We're going to route this top edge, so I'm not going to hit that. And I'm also going to sand off any lettering that's on the lumber that we use down below. So I'm going to go through and palm sand this whole workbench. To put a roundover edge on this top, I have a router with a roundover router bit on, and it's 3/8. And I'm just going to hold this square flat right on the top and tight against the edge, and then run across the edge in order to round it over. Before applying the polyurethane finish, I'm going to take my air compressor with a spray nozzle and blow the top off. That way we have the dust removed from the top. I could also use a cheesecloth here, but because there's a lot of dust, blowing it off with the air hose is essential anyways. And this is for a workshop, so it doesn't have to be the perfect finish. So if you're looking for a really good finish, there's several other options out there as well. But for this is going to be perfect. And you also want to make sure the dust is very clean out of the area if you're looking for a professional finish. But again, this is a DIY option that I'm doing. So I'm going to spray off the top here now. I'm going to throw my dust mask on here in a minute, but this is how it works. You just literally spray the dust off the top and get close to it to make sure you remove all of it before applying your finish. I'm now going to apply the polyurethane to the top. Something about this polyurethane, it's water-based, meaning it doesn't have near the harsh fumes like the oil-based polyurethane. But because of that, it also isn't as durable compared to the oil-based. Because this is water-based, I can do this indoors with no problem. So that's why I went with the water-based. Now we're going to go ahead and pop this open and stir it up very well before using it. I have a stir stick. And I'm going to stir this up, like I said, very well. You'll notice that this polyurethane is not near as thick as the oil-based either. All right, now that we're stirred up well, I'll put a link in the description below so you can check out this polyurethane for yourself. I have a 4-inch foam brush here for this application. To apply the polyurethane, we want to use our foam brush. We want to place a light coat onto the top. You don't want to put this on heavy. Just a nice light coat, just like that. Really not too complicated. And this stuff dries relatively fast, so it isn't near as self-leveling as the oil-based, but that is why it's important just to put a light coat on. And then while we're at it, we can hit the edge as we go. And we simply do that to the whole top. This top has been drying for 2 hours and it's now ready to put on the second coat of polyurethane. And before I put on that second coat, I'm going to sand with 220 grit. And I'm just going to go over the whole table lightly, then peel off the sanding pad, then just take my hand and hit the edges real quick. And then we'll be ready for our next coat. But before I put on the next coat, I'm going to take the air hose and blow off all the dust that's created with this 220. I'm also going to wear a respirator. But I just want to demonstrate on how to sand with this. You just go over it real lightly like so. And you'll feel that smooth out really well, because what happens when that polyurethane hits the wood, it raises the grain, so just a real light sanding will smooth it right out. It's now time to install these Workbench casters, and I'll put a link to these in the description below as well. These are going to give me the ability to move my workbench around, and I'm going to assemble these real quick. I pre-assembled this section of the casters. We got the section here that holds the wheel, followed by the lever that's going to lift up the workbench up off the floor. And I need to install this 1.5 inches to the bottom of it up off the floor. I could simply just use a 2x4 block to get that measurement and make a mark. And then I can just line this right up to the bottom with that mark being the reference. But with this case, I can just butt it up tight against this 2x4 and that's going to work out great. So I'm going to just hold this right into position, right in the center of the post, and install the supplied screws into these holes to hold it onto place. I'm going to install all 6 screws. I'm now going to install the wheel. It's going to slide into this bracket like so, then install this large nut to hold it onto the bracket. Using the 2 supplied wrenches, I'm going to tighten that down all the way onto the bracket. In order to use this, we just step down on it. And that elevates it up off the floor so we can roll it around. So I'm going to install all 4 of these, and then I'm going to show you how to work it. In order to use the Workbench caster wheels, all we have to do is simply step down on all 4 corners. And you can see it's lifting it up as I lower them. And now we can simply slide it around wherever we need it. We can roll it anywhere we want. So it gives you a lot of options, so I can move it out of the way, work on a project with it out of the way, then roll it back into place, and then lower it back down where it came from. To lower it, we just lift them back up. With the caster wheels back down, we're solid on the floor again. That's what we want. So that's a really nice feature to add to your workbench. If you'd like to see how I'm going to build a workstation with a sink and concrete countertops in my garage, check out this video. It'll help you out.